To you, the saints. This sermon recap is for All Saints Sunday, the year B, the year of Mark. Preached at University Lutheran, November 4th, the year 2012. All Saints is a church holiday that has been around. In fact, this is how I began the sermon. Been around from anywhere between 1200 and 1400 years, depending on which pope you cite and whether we're talking the Eastern Church or the Western Church or the commemoration of the bones of St. Peter or the death of a emperor's wife. But we've been doing this, remembering the saints for a long time. When the Reformation happened in the 16th century, the All Saints' Day stayed on the church calendar. But in a broader sense, the remembering of all the saints, not those exclusively labeled as saints in the Western thought, but all saints, all Christians, all folks who have belonged to the faith. And then slowly, this inclusion of all saints living in those at rest, not only those who have died as saints, but those saints of us who are still in the fight and still in this life. And so that is why we celebrate it. After November 1st, the text for the year of Mark, the year B, we get this beautiful picture from Isaiah 25. On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. And God will wipe away from his people all tears, and he will swallow death forever. A second lesson from the book of Revelation, also this apocalyptic sense of a feast in heaven. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. See, the home of God is among man, among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. See, I'm making all things new, God says. The one seated on the throne, he is the Alpha and the Omega. And then from John 11, the second part of the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, when Jesus has this conversation with Mary, who kneels at his feet, and Jesus calls out Lazarus' name, and he comes forth, and Jesus declares, unbind him and let him go. I repeated this refrain that this is why I call you saints. That actually began for me a long time ago on my internship at Lear Lutheran Church up in Posen, Michigan. That as I sat down to write my very first newsletter, not knowing exactly what I should say or how I should say things or why it was important that I should write an article, and now it's become one of my greatest joys, looking for a way simply to put something on paper as a first strike of the keyboard. And so began to think about that since Paul addressed the Christians at Corinth and Ephesus and Rome and all those folks as saints, to the saints who are at Rome, to the saints who are at Ephesus, that it was simply a way to begin. I didn't think it was all that imaginative or all that original. But again, in the life of my ministry for some 20 plus years, as I meet with folks from Posen, from Wymore, from Stoughton, from New Richmond, the fact that I've always addressed parishioners as saints seems to matter. So that's the first reason I call you saints, is that because Paul did it a long time ago, 2,000 years ago. So I call you saints, and not only because Paul did it, but also in the way that Paul did it, I believe, is because I love you. And so that's why is the first reason that I call you saints. But also lastly and most importantly is I call you saints because you belong to Christ, because you belong to God. God is the one who declares anything and all things holy because God declares it so. And so those who belong to Christ, those who belong to God, are by definition then holy, set apart, saints. I know why it is that All Saints takes on this direction, this momentum of remembering those who have died. And so typically we did here at university that we light a special candle and we read out the names. Not just, some churches just do it from the names of those who have died from last All Saints. We invite any and all to remember any of the saints who have died, no matter when, how long ago. And we light a candle. We do a thanksgiving of baptism. Yesterday we lit the candle very near the baptismal font, because in that baptism is in how we belong to God as child, as daughter, as son. I understand why All Saints has that sense, because it seems like when we're living, we kind of are our own to our own keeping, and yet in dying, there is a sense for all of us that when a loved one dies, we lose something. Something is taken from us, and so we commend that one to God. The hymn that we sang right before the sermon was "Shall We All Gather at the River?" And "Shall We Gather at the River?" And it's the song that's most sung in westerns. As kind of an aside here, as a tidbit, that, and again, it makes sense to me that it's always sung a cappella there at the grave in the middle of the West, in the middle of the prairie, in the middle of the mountains, a crudely dug grave covered with rocks. And then in westerns, they're always singing "Shall We Gather at the River?" because there is a sense that in life we are our own keepers. The old saying that God made all of us, but Colonel Colt made us all equal with the six gun, with the peacemaker. But there's something helpless and final in the death of anyone. And so in westerns, there is that sense that then we give that one to God, that we entrust that one. So shall we gather at the river with all the saints? In our own worship, in our own funeral services, the very last things typically that we do before we leave the church, and if there is a burial, go to the cemetery, is that we commend the dying back to God. I always say that God spends all of our own lives commending us to one another. Say, here is daughter, here is son, here is mother, here is father, here is brother, here is sister, here is friend. So God is always about the business in our life together of commending us to one another. See, love this one. This is brother. See, love this one. This one is friend. The last thing that we do when someone has died is that we remind God, that we commend the saint back to God and say, God, remember, this one is a sheep of your own flock, a sinner of your own redeeming. That the last breath that we have for the one who has died is that we commend them back to God. And so that we are like Mary and Martha, we are like the Christ who stands at the grave of Lazarus. And Jesus in John's gospel it's a hard word for us to translate, but there is this kind of angst, this kind of groaning that's more like anger. And that we, with Jesus and Mary and Martha, that we stand over and against death and deny death the final victory. But that we say with Mary and Martha, Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life, do you believe? And we say, even with tears in our eyes, even with terrible pain in the bottom of our stomachs at that which and that one that we've lost, that we say death does not have the final victory. But living and dead, living and those at rest, really, I call you saints because you belong to God. So I understand that one piece makes some sense because we have died and so we entrust them to God, but really we entrust one another to God. And so that's kind of the last point. This is why I call you saints, is because we are given to one another. I said, I don't know by definition if there's really a singular version of the word saints. And now I know grammatically you take off the S and it becomes saint. And I call people saint. But really, by definition, saints are always in relationship and in relation to the Christ. And saints are always in relation to one another. That's why I call you saints, is because we've been given to one another as brothers and sisters. And the space that is between us is where faith lives. The space that is between me and you and all these saints that have allowed me to come alongside in their life to talk about faith. It's in the space in between us that Christ arrives and speaks resurrection and speaks hope and speaks faith. That I said last week on Reformation, we kind of played with this 20 years back and 20 years forward, so the span of 40 years. And to be honest, and thinking about all the places that I've been in all these 20 years, it's not so much about place, and it's not so much about calendar and time and years gone by. It is. I'm an older person now. But it's really about the faces that I see in my head when I think about the saints. All these ordinary folks of faith that in loving and encouraging and forgiving and failing and frailing, that somehow along the way that they have allowed me to be saint and allowed and spoken to me forgiveness and hope and faith. It's in between us. And the minute we forget that somehow sainthood is as if it's in a vacuum and that it's about me, about some good that I've done, that we've missed completely the point of what I believe the church has always emphasized in the best way, that we belong to one another as saints. This is why I call you saints, because Paul loved the saints and wrote to the saints because you belong to God, because the church has said it and celebrated it for a long time, but mostly, finally, lastly, because I love you as saints. So, this is why I call you saints, to you the saints who gather this day, those saints living and those at rest. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Be well in all things.